Where's another place in scripture where we see a pagan god being created? It wasn't present, but it wasn't there before. Mount Sinai. Isn't that in essence the creation of a god? Oh, I just threw the gold in the fire and look what came out. That was Aaron's definition of description of what happened. Now we know that's not what happened. That was a lie. But here we see this person in power, Nebuchadnezzar, creating this image of gold. All right. Now, why? I want to think for a minute. Why is this chapter important for us in this chapter? This image is going to be created. Are we okay? Everything?
Well, come on now. Zoom said they couldn't hear, so he's.
Ignore me
Okay.
as much as possible.
Well, it was they just finished with the dream, and Nebuchadnezzar was so excited he fell prostrate before Daniel, paid him honor, ordered all this, and incense, and now he's made his own gods.
Yeah.
We just finished saying all those wise men and all those magicians, they're worthless. They don't have anybody they can
Right.
praise. But your God is the real God.
Right.
Now,
The God of Daniel is to be worshipped, and there's to be nothing said ill of the God of Daniel. That's how chapter 2 ends.
How much later is this? Does this take place?
We're not told.
Yeah.
But I think it's pretty quick. To some degree. However, I would say this, enough time has gone by that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have gathered the ire of the satraps. Okay? They're targeted in this chapter. Okay? By the way, we haven't read all the chapter, but who's not mentioned in this chapter?
Daniel.
Daniel's not even in this chapter. So what are we to gain from this? Why is this chapter in the prophecy of Daniel, the book of Daniel, that's written for the Hebrews? Okay, we need to look at it through that lens. Why is this chapter so important for the Hebrews to know? What is the walkaway that is the message God wants to give the Hebrews in exile? Okay, well, so we need to look for that. All right, there are certain passages we're going to get into later in the book that are highly apocryphal. Right? And then there's other chapters like here in chapter 2 and chapter 3 that is reads very historical. Okay. Where we see actual demonstrations, okay, of the pictures that are painted in the apocryphal chapters. But the lessons in the apocryphal chapters are the same lessons that he's given to us in these historical chapters. So it's important to see these, understand the messages, and the point that the Hebrews are to learn from this, so that when we see the apocryphal chapters later, we're going to see, okay, God is just telling them this or showing them this, and yet another way for them to learn it. A God of the sort revealed in Daniel cannot be successfully opposed, and no people loved by such a God can be losers. That's the point of this chapter. Let me say that again. A God of the sort revealed of Daniel cannot be successfully opposed, and no people loved by such a God can be losers. Do you think the Hebrews feel up right now? How's the morale among the Hebrew nation?
They're probably feel pretty defeated.
How do you think the French felt in 1941? Okay. How do you think the people in Belgium felt the week after Dunkirk? How would they feel? Vanquished, defeated, Jerusalem burnt, the walls destroyed, the temple destroyed. They're where? Were they allowed just to pay tribute and they're left alone? No, they're not in the promised land anymore. Where are they? These Hebrew captives. They're in bondage in Babylon, okay? They've been moved out of the homeland promised to Abraham. And now we see in chapter 3, another lesson God wants these people to learn. As we mentioned before, Daniel's not even mentioned in this chapter. And yet we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego now are center stage. Let's talk a little bit about this image that gets created that they're going to be expected, and all of everyone in Babylon is going to be expected to bow down and worship to. What does verse 1 say? Who made this image?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar made this image. The king made an image of gold. Here we go again. Why do men continually want to reverse roles with God? Is that not what Nebuchadnezzar is doing here? He has made an image of himself, hasn't he? And what does he want as a result of this image from the people?
Worship.
Worship the God of Daniel from chapter 2. Worship who? Worship me. Worship me. You know, I watched a speech on television last night called the State of the Union. And it always intrigues me. No matter who gives that speech, there's a whole lot of worship me behind the scenes of that. Doesn't matter what they say. Doesn't matter who it is. People in that power position wanted to be there. Why? What's their motivation? There's a whole lot of me wrapped up in that. That's just politics. That's politicians. Nebuchadnezzar's a politician. So he goes to build an idol for these people to worship. It's easy to say now for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to go along with Daniel and say, oh, I believe Daniel. Yeah, I'm with you, Daniel. Like we saw in chapter 2, because Daniel had to do what? Did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have to stand before Nebuchadnezzar and interpret the dream? No, Daniel did. So who was on point for that issue? Daniel was. So it's really easy to sit back and say, yeah, Daniel, good job. You got the interpretation. You go tell him. You go get the grand and great result that we see in chapter 2. And now, though, from that academic discussion of chapter 2 for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what does chapter 3 show us happens? It just got real, didn't it? You said you believe in Jehovah God and prayed with Daniel for the interpretation to be given to Daniel. You're all in. But that's a very different thing to have than to come over here and now be confronted with what they see in chapter 3 happened to them. Daniel's not anywhere around, is he? Not even mentioned in this chapter. I don't know why, but he's not. Evidently, he's not here. Doesn't seem to be. So now Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have to do what?
Stand up for what they believe.
They have to stand up for their belief in Jehovah God, don't they? Well, is there a lesson in that for anybody in particular? Like maybe the Hebrew captives? And what would that lesson be?
Stand up regardless.
You're going to have to stand up for your faith in God. How about us? There's going to be times where you are going to have to stand up for your faith, and you're going to have to make your faith your own. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had this happen in this chapter. They had to demonstrate that their faith was their own. And I think because of the result of what we see in chapter 3 in this fiery furnace, you'd have to add Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the Faithful Hero Hall of Fame. When it says by the Hebrew writer, and there are many others we can speak of also, you'd have to think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because their temptation or what they were faced with was as horrible as it could be made real on earth for another human. They say that dying of fire is one of the most painful, horrific ways to die. And they were faced with that based on their actions. And so we see the setup now is here. The challenge then is worship the idol or what? Die. And not die easy. Die hard. Die hard. And so we see this, and it is interesting that there is an opportunity in verse 7 or in verse 6 and 7 that this idea of compromise could be introduced here for them. What could Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego done to appease this? What was the temptation?
Everyone else is doing it.
Everyone bowed down. You think every single person in this grand multitude actually was worshiping that God when they bowed down? Why do you think many of them might have been bowed down? If not worship.
You said you have to go into the.
So they didn't go to the fire, right? So they didn't die the fiery death. Let's just compromise. I'll hold my heart back. I will go through the motions, but God knows in my heart, I'm not truly worshiping this pagan idol that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. My inner core is still Hebrew. And that'll be okay. Do we do that? How are some ways we can do that? I know I shouldn't go to this business dinner because there's going to be a whole lot of drinking and carousing going on. But everybody there at that meeting knows that I don't drink and carouse. But there's good, important business contacts there that it's beneficial for me to be there for that. So I'm going to go and put in my little core my Christianity so that it won't be impinged on. And I'm going to compromise where I am and what I'm doing so that I can have both. What was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's position here in chapter 3, by the way?
They've been elevated by Daniel at this point.
They were the governors of the province where this was happening, which was Babylon. They had been elevated already by Nebuchadnezzar and with Daniel. They were in charge here, and they're in a pretty good state. They might have gotten a little comfortable. Maybe they didn't see this ambush coming. But they got set up, didn't they? And so now they have to figure a way out of this. And so the temptation could have been, well, let me just do this, but I won't let my core be involved. I'll just go through the motions. But God knows that I'm really not part of this. I'm just doing it to maintain my position because I can do so much more for my fellow Hebrew captives if we stay as leaders within this province. But we can do that with our clothes. We can do that with our entertainment. We do that with other activities as well. They never and did not try to compromise this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego saw this for what it was. A direct challenge to them of their faith. Are you in or are you out? How did they respond? Well, let me tell you, in verse 8, it says, wherefore at that certain time, certain Chaldeans came near and brought accusation against the Jews. Oh, don't ever forget that people are watching. People are watching. Out of this entire multitude, everybody's bowing down except 3 people. And the Chaldeans come in going, Nebuchadnezzar, these 3 right here, these 3, they didn't bow. You see the ambush that's happening here? By the way, these Chaldeans, who do they owe their lives to at this point already? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego for interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Because what was Nebuchadnezzar ready to do in chapter 2?
Destroy all of them.
Destroy everybody. All the wise men, Chaldeans included, because they could not interpret the dream. It just shows you how far jealousy and hatred and racism can go. These Chaldeans did not like, and it's not lost on me that it doesn't say he brought accusation against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which happened to be Babylonian names. It says that they brought accusation against the Jews. Now it's race. Those nasty, filthy, captive Jews. They won't bow down to your God. It's interesting also, as we read on, let's read down 9 through 12. They answered and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, or dulcimer, and all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth down and worship it shall be cast into the midst of a fiery furnace. But there are certain Jews, there's that word again, Jews, whom thou hast appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. What's the accusation against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? That they've got another religion going on? What's the charge here?
They're just not worshiping the God.
And what's the threat? But what's the threat? Yeah, they're not worshiping the gods, but what's the threat?
Of what? Of who? Of
What's the threat to Nebuchadnezzar?
they haven't paid regard to you.
Yeah, you have not regarded Nebuchadnezzar. They have not regarded you, king. You've got 3 governors in your main province, and there's rebellion going on. What's the greatest fear of any king? Foreign enemies? Assassination. Where does assassination come from? Within. Almost exclusively, assassinations in the ancient empires always occurred from within. And so the threat here is rebellion within the ranks of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. Is that a pretty serious charge? It's not religious blasphemy they're getting charged with. Oh, they don't believe your God's a real God, so that's why they're not bowing down. That's not what they're saying here to Nebuchadnezzar. They're charging them with rebellion and civil conflict and wanting to overturn the authority of Nebuchadnezzar. Wow. Is there another example in Scripture where someone is charged with being the source of rebellion against the empire of their time? What was the charge brought by the Jews on Jesus to Pilate? Was it that he had blasphemed Jehovah God by claiming to be the Messiah? That's what the charge was before the high priest, wasn't it? But when they got to the Roman court in front of Pilate, what was their charge? Rebellion. He says he's a king. We say, who's only our king? Only Caesar is our king. What a bunch of hypocrites, right? Only Caesar is our king. This man is full of rebellion and sedition. They're being charged with the same thing here. It's the same charge that their Lord centuries later would be charged with. Now, when we look at Nebuchadnezzar in verse 13, then what happens?
He's angry.
Yeah, not a little bit either, is he? Then in his rage and fury, he commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before the king. So now Daniel's been before the king and interpreted his dream. And now Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are brought before the king. And then in 14, it's interesting. Nebuchadnezzar knows these three men. He knows these men. He probably knows their character. But he is so mad. In verse 14, he says to them what?
But gives him another chance.
Yeah, I can't believe I've heard what I'm hearing. Tell me this is not what is happened. Just tell me it didn't happen. He gives them another chance. And so now this double test is placed upon Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Not only they had to resist this furious tyrant, but also he was the one who had given them their exalted positions. How hard is it for you to go against a boss that's been very good to you? To speak out against something they're doing that's wrong. You ever been in that position? You may not have been in that position. A lot of times in medicine, you get in that position and even lives are at stake, right? You got a doctor you're working for, hand in glove, you think he has hung the moon, and he is fantastic. But he decides one day to push that influence in a way he shouldn't take advantage of it, and you get caught as the nurse, Connie. What do you do? It's hard to call him on the carpet in that situation, isn't it? Let me tell you, it's hard when your career is on the line, that your mentor who has brought you along and elevated you and he's been promoted, you get promoted, okay? And then one day he does something that's against federal law. What do you do? Well, it wasn't easy. What are you gonna do? Because it's real easy to become complicit to that. And so we see this. And so which is harder to face, the tyrant or the disappointment that you disappointed your mentor? Which is the harder piece of this? I don't know. Both are tremendously difficult to deal with. Most men can oppose their enemies, but it takes a special person to oppose their friends. I think that's part of what's in play here. He says at the end of verse 15, who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? That he has given them another chance. They have said to him, basically, what you have heard is correct. Nebuchadnezzar says in verse 15, who is this God who can deliver you out of my hands? Boy, I don't know how much time really went between chapter 2 and chapter 3, but hasn't Nebuchadnezzar already been introduced to who this God is? Who actually could deliver them from his hands? He has been exposed to Jehovah, but he is no believer. Who does this remind you of? Does this remind you of anybody else? Any other pagan king? Pharaoh. Almost identical words come from the mouth of Pharaoh. And who taught Pharaoh who Jehovah truly was? Moses. God used Moses to deliver to Pharaoh a 10-lesson correspondence course of who Jehovah God was, called the plagues. Because Pharaoh hardened his heart to him and said, and he says, let me see if I got the quote here. Who is Jehovah that I should obey him? That's Pharaoh said that to Moses. Who is Jehovah that I should obey him? Nebuchadnezzar is about to be taught this same lesson as well. So then in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answer Nebuchadnezzar. We have no need to answer you in this matter. If our God is able, if it's be so with our God is the idea. Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace, and he is able to deliver us out of thy hand, O king. You know, Nebuchadnezzar has tried intimidation here. It didn't work. The presence of the fiery furnace has not worked. His edicts of death have not worked. These men are not bowing down to him, and he has not gotten them to bow to the political pressures of I elevated you. What are you doing? I think of the song we sing a lot of times, I'm not ashamed to own my Lord. Next time you sing that song, think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm not ashamed to own my Lord. What did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego know or see or have faith in that was far worse than Nebuchadnezzar and the furnace? They knew of the wrath of God. You know, it reminds me of the story of there's this man who said there's this man who was a great photographer, and he had an absolute fear of dogs. He was scared to death of dogs, ferocious dogs. And one day he was out in the woods and he saw this baby bear and he wanted to take a picture of it, get a photograph of it. So he got out of his car and he got down and got this great close-up of this cute baby bear, only to realize that came crashing out of the woods just as he snapped the picture was that cute baby bear's mother. And that mother bear raised up, charged him. He saw that bear coming. He made it back to the car, slammed the door and got inside just in time as she crashed up against the car's door that was closed, and he was able to save his life. And you know what? His fear of dogs after that was cured forever. Because he had run smack dab into something that truly made that look minuscule. Sometimes we think that life's big problems are just so overwhelming. Don't lose sight of who is on our side, but also understand the fearful respect that we must have for that God. Because in comparison to what Nebuchadnezzar can do, what can Jehovah do? The creator of all things. Jehovah is going to demonstrate, Nebuchadnezzar, you can start a fire, but I'm Lord of the fire. Let's look on there. This is some of what we've said. This idea of this idol. You think about, where did the idea of this idol even come from? It sure sounds like he decided to build for him what his vision gave him in chapter 2, wasn't it? He gets the vision in chapter 2 and he turns around and builds it in chapter 3. And then in chapter 3, he says what about it? It's gone. No, it's a vision that God gave you, and the message is from God, but you are no God. But that's where the idea, I think, came from. And isn't that what Satan does to us? Doesn't he twist God's messages? So maybe that's what's at play here. Nebuchadnezzar got God's message, and then Satan enters his heart and twists that message into something else, such as this is an opportunity, Nebuchadnezzar, this grand vision, that you should make this idol and have everybody bow down to it. After all, you're the golden empire. Perhaps that's behind it. But here's the charge of rebellion. These men have not regarded you, but they regarded God far more. Look at verse 14 again. It is of purpose that this is happening. Who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? As we read about Pharaoh's clothes. Verse 16, our God whom we serve is able. Now look on down in verses 19 through the end of the chapter. We see these men are taken in Nebuchadnezzar's full of fury, it says, in the verse 19, and the form of his visage changed. He was so mad, he contorted his face. He couldn't even contain this rage. And it changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he said, heat the furnace 7 times hotter. And in verse 21, these men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were bound, and them and all of their garments were cast into the midst of the fiery furnace. Verse 21. Well, verse 21, the king wins, the rebellion is crushed, and it's all over. Oh no. Because they get thrown in, the king has done all he can do to these men, and then what? These 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, verse 23, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. But then look at verse 24. Then the king was astonished, and he rose up in haste, because he had looked into and said, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They said, yes, that's true, O king. You could all see him, and you said, yes, O king. He said, well, then answer me, why then do I see 4 men? And what's interesting about these men at this point? Are they bound?
Loose.
They're loose. Well, how'd they get loose? I don't know if the 4th man loosed those bonds, or whether the fire itself of the trial burned the bonds off of these men. So what turned out to be a fiery torment for them actually could have been the means at which they were ultimately freed. They were not bound inside the fire. When you get thrown into the fire, oftentimes you find freedom. Because you've held to what? You've held to your integrity. You've held to your faith. And that can be freeing. You know, if I lie all the time, what do I have to do? I have to remember all the lies I told and who I told them to. What if I always tell the truth? I don't have to worry about anything because I always tell the truth. It's freeing, isn't it? This one's harder to do. Ultimately, it's a whole lot easier. Just tell the truth all the time. You're not bound to anything. So these men are loose. And it says in the end of verse 25, I see 4 men loose. They entered the fire, but the fire freed them from their bonds. And there is a 4th one now that's among them. And Nebuchadnezzar says, this 4th one is like a son of the gods. So I tend to think that that's an angel. Okay. God is at work here. And he has sent an angel to care for these men. Look at down in verse 28, it says, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him. Who's paying attention to the trials of these people? These people. Jehovah's paying attention to it, and he sent his angel to help them. Do you often think that you're alone in your trials? Oh, yeah. Woe is me. You know, the classic example of Elijah. Lord, I'm the only one left that can serve you in all of Israel. And Jehovah says what? Get up, get out of this cave, and get back in the game. I got thousands of people in Palestine that still have not bowed to Baal. So Elijah, you got work to do. But Elijah was too busy having a pity party in that cave for himself. We often do that. What we don't realize is there's this 4th person in the cave, in that fire with us, in our trials with us. That God is always with us. And here we see actual observation of that truth. God puts this in a visual reality for Nebuchadnezzar to witness for us. Did the Israel or the Hebrew captives in Israel in captivity, did they need this lesson? Is this fiery furnace that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego bound and thrown into, Is that not an analogy to what the entire nation feels they are going through right now? God told them for 70 years, you're gonna be bound to be in captivity. 70 years. And now they're in it. But guess what? You're not in it alone, Israel. Any more than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the fiery furnace by themselves. Now, is that important for the Hebrew people to know? Is their God a God of Jerusalem and Jerusalem only? No. He is the God of all, including ruling Nebuchadnezzar, their captor. That is an invaluable lesson for them to know. And should you bow down to idols?
No.
No. You know, you can think a lot in the time of Daniel, when they went into captivity, what was Israel's greatest problem from the time they left Israel or Egypt until now?
Idolatry.
Idolatry. 70 short years in their grand scheme of history as a nation. Just 70 years. Is that a problem when they come back? It is never a problem again. How did that get burned out? Somehow, in 70 short years, the issue of idolatry got cauterized out of the heart of the Hebrew nation. Perhaps chapter 3 is the explanation for that. Maybe so. Because it wasn't a problem for them anymore. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusted in the Lord. They trusted in him. And how were they affected by the fire? They weren't affected at all. How about their clothes? They come out smelling like smoke? Nope. They were completely and totally unscathed. Now, my question for you is, after we read verse 28, blessed Nebuchadnezzar is overwhelmed by all this. He says, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel, delivered his servants that trusted him, and have changed the king's words, and yielded their bodies that they might not serve or worship any God except their own God. Hey, Nebuchadnezzar, what about your image? How important is the image now in verse 28 to Nebuchadnezzar? It's like he's totally forgotten this grand statue that's 90 feet tall, standing next to him when this is going on. It doesn't matter to Nebuchadnezzar anymore because of what he has seen. Now, how do the two gods compare between Jehovah and this God that Nebuchadnezzar built? Is that an important lesson for the Hebrew nation? Oh, yes, it most certainly is. And so in 29, we see, therefore I, Nebuchadnezzar, I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that is able to deliver after this sort. You know, Nebuchadnezzar is, he is a champion of the obvious, isn't he? All of a sudden, he is converted by this. Everything he says in verse 29 is now it's so obvious. Yes, of course, there's no other God that's able to deliver of this sort. And there was no other God that can interpret the dream that you had, and we did it as the way that we did it in chapter 2. This God is the God. But look how he frames it. You'll be cut in pieces, your houses will be made dunghill, because there is no other God that's able to deliver after this sort. Sounds almost like a little caveat, doesn't it? So my question for you then is this. Does King Nebuchadnezzar at the end of chapter 3 believe in Jehovah God? Believe, in the true sense of the word believe. Is he a convert? Does he believe now? Had the dream interpreted? Nobody else could do it. Only a God, his own Chaldean said what? Only a God could do what you've asked us to do. And lo and behold, that's what happened. Only a God could save 3 men from this fiery furnace. And that's exactly what happened. So is King Nebuchadnezzar on God's side now? Well, we're gonna see that he is not. He is converted to a degree, but he is not convinced. It's kind of like Pharaoh. Okay, you can go, but you gotta leave your cattle behind. Okay, you can go, but your wives and children have to stay behind. Okay, you can go, make these plagues go away. You can go, but just don't go far. Eventually, finally, of course, Jehovah breaks Pharaoh. And he says what? Just go. Take all this gold with you and go. Now, it won't happen in Nebuchadnezzar's time, but in Cyrus's time, what is going to happen is growth.
Come on, God.
You go and take all this gold that was taken by Nebuchadnezzar from your temple and these vessels of worship, and you go and go back, because we know that your God is a mighty God. You see, there's going to be others that have to act upon this, but Nebuchadnezzar never gets there. He doesn't get there. And so we see this conflict is here. He accommodates the worshiping of Jehovah. And this had to have been comforting to the Hebrew people, because this edict of the king then now means what? What can the Hebrews do now freely in the Babylonian Empire? They can worship God without fear of molestation and persecution for their worship. These Chaldeans and satraps, they can't do what anymore? They can't set up these pagan gods for them to worship. The people in captivity can now worship their God. Interesting. Nebuchadnezzar has had it proven very clearly to him that he is powerless over the will of God.
He was lucky it only cost him a few of his mighty men.
Yes, it did. Went the wrong way. So when we see this convicted king, God delivered his servants that trusted in him. Nebuchadnezzar says that. And he realizes, I think, that these three men, this is not rebellion of him, but it's obedience to God that these men did what they did. He doesn't have any choice here. He's politically saving face on the plains of Shinar here. And so that's what he does. And he issues this edict. And this is something that Israel is going to need for the next 70 years. This is no small thing that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because of their faith, accomplished for the entire nation of Israel. Why is this important for 70 years? To be able to worship Jehovah God. Why is that important?
God is preparing a remnant.
What does the remnant need to know when they go back?
God is.
They need to know who God is. Who are we going back for? And more importantly, what is his plan for us that we're going back for? What's involved in all of this? You see why this was important? Extremely important. And so we look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego sometimes as kind of this footnote in the book of Daniel. Oh yeah, those were Daniel's companions. I'm not sure who did the biggest amount of work for the people of Israel that we've seen so far in the book, at least so far. I'm not so sure Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't accomplish more for the nation than Daniel has at this point. These are mighty men. They're mighty men of faith. And they probably didn't even think about it that way, but they accomplished great things through their own personal trials. Look at the consequences of their faith. Because they were faithful, what blessings happened? It's amazing what all was able to happen because of what they did. And I think there's a lesson in that for us too. Okay, comments or questions on this chapter?
I think it's very clear and evident that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were practicing exactly what Daniel did in chapter 1 and verse 8. That they had already purposed in their hearts And again, it's not this, it's not like Daniel as well, where it's, okay, if this specific situation ever comes along, this is exactly what I'm going to do. But they were holding on to, again, knowing who God is, holding on to that so that no matter else what came, they knew what they weren't going to let go of. So they didn't doubt it. And talk about preparing the remnant. Learning that.
This is a tremendous analogy of what's happening here with these three men compared to the entire nation as a whole. Were these three men able to do this just on a whim, last minute decision? No, I'm faithful to God. No, they had developed this faith. They had instilled within themselves. Their families had instilled it before they came. They instilled it with themselves and their and righteous companions. They have built themselves up to this point. God has rewarded and blessed them from that. They have grown into this position, so they are ready and prepared for this moment. They're prepared. And they're successful. They are successful. They do not fail. They do not fail their people. This was a personal trial. And there was so much riding on it. There was so much riding on it. What else?
One more thing, they're promoted another time.
Yeah, at the end of this, they get promoted even more, don't they? They get more responsibility as a result of all this. So even more blessings are given to them as a result of them going through this fiery trial. I cannot imagine the fear, as faithful as they were, of just physically being bound into a fiery furnace that had already eaten up the bodies of those who had built the fire. I mean, they already have seen and smelled the burnt flesh of that, and now they're getting to be thrown into it even after it's hotter. Talk about courage. I mean, it's amazing what they went through. Okay, just a tremendous passage of that should be very inspiring to us to consider. This was no small chapter. God is the God of fire. Our God is the God of fire. Who controls it? God does. Does the whim of a king have priority over God's will? Oh, no. No, no. All right, next week we're going to be in chapter 4. And we see now in chapter 2 and chapter 3 this character Nebuchadnezzar. How does he describe Nebuchadnezzar? After reading up through chapter 3. Wishy-washy? Is he a strong leader? Decisive? He's strong?
He's rash.
He's rash. We see he's got a temper, doesn't he? Arrogant. I think he's very arrogant. I mean, it's not your typical leader that decides, I'm going to make myself a god. I'm going to build this 90-foot tall statue of myself and have the entire kingdom have to bow down to it as part of the new civil ordinances, right? I think that's a pretty arrogant person to do that. There's somebody in our lifetime that did that over in Iraq. Saddam Hussein had statues of himself all over the country. Every city square had a statue of Saddam Hussein on it. What did he expect those people to do? In essence, bow down to him. Give obeisance to him. Because he was a dictator of that nature. Nebuchadnezzar was every bit of that. And so when we get into chapter 4, we're going to see that God is not only a God of interpretation and dreams, he's a God of the fire, and the master of that. He's going to be a humbler of the crowd. And that's going to be what we look at next week. Because Nebuchadnezzar is going to come face to face himself with his own trials with God. And that will be an interesting chapter to look at. So if you want to prep, you can look at it. Chapter 4 has some more dreams in it. We will do chapter 4 next week. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, that's me. It's not